Okay, without further ado, tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about a topic that is probably somewhat near and dear to some of you in this room, but perhaps may also be something of a curiosity to many of you who are present tonight. I'm talking about the Pennsylvania Dutch practice known as PowWow, which covers a broad range of ritual practices that were used for healing, protection, and assistance in times of need. Many times these are based in words and prayers, sometimes things that folks will refer to as charms or verbal incantations, as well as a laying on of hands or the use of physical agents, even in some cases herbs. So many of the things I'm going to be speaking about today encompass a broad range of things that were primarily done in the past, but also many of the things I'll be speaking about have continued until the present day. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how times have changed and about many of the different types of cultural influences that have been going on over the past 3 centuries of Pennsylvania Dutch presence here in the United States, and how things have changed from the earliest times of immigration, where these traditions came from, or at least I should say where we believe that they came from, because there is still some controversy about this, as well as, of course, where we are left today, in the present day, when we have to consider how much do these practices continue. How many, just a quick show of your hands, how many of you consider yourself Pennsylvania Dutch who are here tonight? Fantastic, I'm among friends. And of course, for those of you who are not Pennsylvania Dutch, you may also find that there's some commonalities in the experiences I'll be sharing tonight. This is not just relegated to the Pennsylvania Dutch. This is in fact all over the United States. This particular practice spread into the Shenandoah Valley. It spread into the Midwest and to many other parts of the United States. So this has a cross-cultural set of implications to it tonight. Now, one of the things that I did fairly recently was I guest curated an exhibit that was down in Pennsburg at the Schwenkfelder Heritage Center and Library. And one of the things we were drawing upon was the fact that among many families, they will find ritual objects or powwow diaries, a set of instructions that someone has written down for healing practices and rituals, as well as certain objects that may have been used. And one of the things that I did with this particular exhibit was to offer ways in which people may be able to contextualize these things in their lives. It is not uncommon for people in this area to have memories about powwow, and it's also not all that rare for people to have some piece of tangible evidence that was left behind by these practices, whether it's a book or a manuscript or even a little slip of paper with some form of a prayer written on it that was slipped inside of a Bible that may have been used for healing. My hope is to provide a good solid foundation to the origins of these practices tonight, and also to make sure that people don't feel afraid when they find this kind of material, because some folks may already have an idea that this is, of course, a cultural practice that we don't have to be afraid of, but there are some folks who look at this with a certain level of ambiguity or ambivalence because they may be thinking that there's something wrong here. And my hope is to express why folks have had some misgivings over the years and why times have changed, while maintaining that one of the most important things we can do in the present day is try to understand these practices, not merely, judge them or denigrate them. One word I will not be using in my presentation this evening is the word superstition. So if you've come to hear about superstitions, you've come to the wrong place. If you've come to learn about folk beliefs, you've come to the right place, because those are the terms I'll be talking about tonight. The word superstition usually implies someone else's beliefs that maybe I don't hold in common, or maybe you don't hold in common, or maybe something that we're skeptical of. Typically, it involves a level of skepticism. So it's important for me to draw that line from the very beginning to let you know I'll be examining beliefs. And I think it's a very important thing, if we're looking at the practices of our ancestors and even practices in the present day, to look at them with a sense of open-mindedness so that we can learn as much as we can from them. It's one of the most important reasons where we're probably on this earth, is to learn from each other. So without further ado, I hope you'll have an opportunity to maybe see some things that you might be familiar with tonight, as well as maybe some new things as well. Now, when I first heard about the practice of powwow, I was about 8 years old. I'm already seeing some nodding heads out there, so folks know where I'm going with this next image, which is always a wonderful thing to see the reinforcement from folks who are present who have a similar experience. When I was 8 years old, my grandmother told me a story about how she had warts on her hand. And at that point in time, she was often helping out on the farm, and she recalled how these warts, of course, were problematic, and her grandfather said, I can get rid of those for you. And she said, oh, really? How would you do that? And he said, well, we might have to wait a little bit until the time of the waxing moon, and I'm going to take you outside, and I'm going to rub a potato on those warts. And she said, okay. And she didn't really know what was going to happen, but he took her outside in the dark of night, under the witness of the moon. The moon was nearly full. He rubbed half of a potato onto each wart, and then he buried it underneath the drain spout. And she recalled that when the warts rotted away, the potatoes were gone. So it's an interesting situation to note that this idea of transference is taking place in this story. The belief was you were actually transferring the illness into the potatoes. And then when potatoes would rot away, so would the warts. So I hadn't really thought of this much as a child. It kind of puzzled me a little bit. I was always interested in the practices of my ancestors, especially my immediate ones. The things that my grandparents told me were always something near and dear to me. So as I investigated this a little bit further, one of the opportunities that presented itself to me was that when I moved from Lebanon County and then also to Adams County and then later to York County in my childhood, I was given more examples of these kinds of stories to add to my repertoire. This was something that interested me. And then when I moved to Kutztown, I actually had the opportunity to study with a folk healer, to actually learn these techniques. So tonight I'm not just talking from a scholarly or academic idea of it. I'm not just studying, but I'm actually talking from the perspective of a person who took the time to learn some of these techniques and also to use them. I'm not advocating that anybody present should follow any of the instructions I've given. That's my official disclaimer for this evening. But what I will say is that they provide a unique way to interact with many of the beliefs that have been held in common by Pennsylvania Dutch people for centuries. Now, one of the things I will mention is that a few years back, I was visiting my brother in Oregon, and he said to me, oh, I heard that you learned how to do that thing with the warts. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I have some warts on my hand. My brother worked in a sawmill at that point in time, and they were very painful to him because he would knock them open on boards, running them through the mills, and he's the person adjusting the machines. So it was very painful for him. So it was fortunate that I was there at a time during the waxing moon. I took him out into the back parking lot behind his apartment, far from the family farm of my grandmother's childhood. And instead, I used some potatoes that he had bought at the supermarket rather than ones that were grown on the farm. And I performed exactly the same ritual that was described to me. And what I said was, was ik strijke nem ab, was ik aguke nem zu. What it is that I am rubbing, may it decrease. And what I am looking at, may it increase. And these are the old Pennsylvania Dutch words that you would use. And in a short period of time, his warts were gone. I had left and come back to Pennsylvania, and it was about 2 weeks later, he had given me a call just to catch up, and he said, hey, the warts are gone, but I have a question. I said, what's that? He said, the potatoes that we buried along the edge of the apartment are starting to sprout. When they're ready, can I eat them? And now the answer to this is no, you shouldn't eat them, because of course the belief is that somehow or other the illness has been passed on. And in other situations you'll find very similar things. I'll mention a ritual later for transferring illness into a tree. And the belief is you have to do this to a tree that bears no fruit, because you don't want one of your neighbors to unsuspectedly pick an apple and then to get whatever you put into the tree. So these are some of the old ideas about transference of illness, and they're very important. But overall, what really needs to be understood from many of these practices is the fact that they're expressions of connections between people. Connections between folks who are part of the same community, as well as connections with perceptions about how the world works. Many people today, of course, firmly have very deep-seated religious beliefs at the same time that they may have scientific beliefs. Those beliefs don't have to be in odds. But when many people look at these rituals among the Pennsylvania Dutch, they kind of scratch their head and say, what exactly is going on here? So I will be referring a little bit to some of the ritual mechanics, if you will, the expectations of how people believed that the world worked in order to facilitate these types of rituals, and the way that some people still believe that the world does work. These are not just beliefs of the past. So these are some of the things I'm hoping to cover tonight. Now, this word, PowWow, is not the only word that people use for the practice. And before I explain where the word PowWow came from, I want to talk about this word as it was originally used in the Pennsylvania Dutch. And the word is braucherij or brauche. Now, the interesting thing about this particular word is that the best definition we have is ritual traditions. But it doesn't directly translate to any one word that we have in English. It really has to almost be explained, because we don't have a word exactly for this. Now, these words, brauche and braucherei, come from two other dialect words. In Pennsylvanisch Deutsch, we have the word brauche, which means to need, to make use of, to try, or to employ. Which is why some people, when they're talking about treating a person with an illness using PowWow, they'll say, I tried for that person, or I will try, or I will try for you. They'll use this word try because it's probably the closest translation to this word braucherei or brauche, the verb to make use of and to employ or to use these customs and traditions. There's also another connotation here, and that is die Bräuche, as you hear it in Standard German, or Bräuche in Pennsylvanisch Deutsch. And this implies the very act of performing a tradition, a custom, a ceremony, a ritual, or a practice. But in Standard German, this word, it doesn't carry the same connotation. If you say this word in Germany today, people will not think about healing and protection and assistance in times of need by use of a ritual. Instead, they're going to be thinking about customs in terms of like holiday customs, the way that we use the word customs today. That's a literal translation. But among the Pennsylvanisch Deutsch, among the Pennsylvania Dutch, this word Bräuche really does imply a ceremony, even an heirloom, the idea of something that's held near and dear. And hopefully after tonight you'll be able to get a glimpse of why it is that this may be considered a family heirloom among some people. So I'll offer the following definition, as this being really kind of the sum total of ritual practices whereby tangible experience is altered by subtle means. The subtle means can be the use of gestures, or prayers, or the use of physical agents like the potato that I mentioned before. And yet at the same time, a tangible experience takes place, some form of a transformation, a visible and discernible and important translation for a person takes place. This is also, of course, as I mentioned again, primarily used for healing, for protections, assistance in times of need, but these are really kind of catch-alls for a lot of different types of experiences where people were trying to make a change. Sometimes even these rituals overlap with culinary practices or farming practices to such a degree that you'll even find that this idea of assistance really is a broad spectrum of things. But it's also a really important way for people to internalize and to understand through a cultural context how to interpret some non-ordinary experiences. Because when you talk to some people about PowWow, they're talking about some very deep religious experiences that may include things like dreams or visions or even spiritual experiences, maybe even with the unknown, or ideas even about ghosts or about spirits. So some of these types of ideas for people are closely allied with this idea of PowWow. Not for everybody, but again, this offers people a cultural lens through which they may interpret some very difficult experiences they may have over the course of their life. And we have to remember that in the past, many people thought about illness as being an inherently supernatural process, not just a physical process, but also a spiritual process. Now, this word PowWow interests a lot of people because, of course, we know it's a Native American word. So why is it being used for a Pennsylvania Dutch practice? This dates back to the 18th century. And this probably was applied to the Pennsylvania Dutch. This was probably not a word that they applied to themselves. We don't know if the Native Americans used this word when they communicated with local Pennsylvania Dutch people about ritual practices, or if it was in fact the English who applied this word. We do know that the word PowWow became incorporated into the English language even before the 18th century. It was in the 17th century because the word was learned from the Algonquin tribes in New England. And what it originally meant was conducting a ceremony, to conduct a ritual. You can start to see some commonality with the definition I've already given about braucherei or Bräuche. And this idea being, of course, customs, traditions, and ceremonies that are being conducted in most cases by a particular individual, a person who would be a healer, who is also known in some cases as a PowWow. This was a word for a shaman within the Algonquin tribes. And the interesting thing about this is the fact that this is even present in 19th century dictionaries that were created in the United States. You won't find that word in the Oxford English Dictionary very early on, but you'll find it in American dictionaries. And it's fascinating because, of course, this word at some point in time was used to talk about the Pennsylvania Dutch traditions. And we don't know if it was the English who maybe said, oh, this looks like something the Native Americans are doing, or if it was the Native Americans who looked at what the Pennsylvania Dutch were doing and said, well, this looks a little bit like what we do. It's uncertain at what point in time this crossed boundaries and became a word that was used to apply to the Pennsylvania Dutch. But what we do know is that in some areas where there was a consistent presence of Native Americans at the same time that you find Pennsylvania Dutch settlement, there was a lot of crossover. The Ole Valley, for instance, right in the heart of Berks County, was such an area. And there were even accounts of people in the late 18th century and early 19th century who recall from the days of their childhood having learned the Lenape language at the same time that they were learning German, because they were growing up in an area that had villages right nearby. The children were playing together. You'll find some crossovers occasionally with some ritual practices too. But the fact is, most of the practices I'll be talking about tonight are distinctly ones that originally came from Europe. It's really that the word powwow has more to do with, of course, this cross-cultural perception about where ritual comes from and what it means and what it implies, even though most of the processes I'll be sharing with you tonight are probably not borrowed from Native Americans, but are definitely coming from Europe. Now, this idea of the powwow doctor is something that really started to capture the American imagination towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And you'll find some sources where images started to abound, such as in like Harper's Weekly and some of these other popular serial magazines. This is one of the earliest known images in the popular press talking about a powwower. And this was from the collection of my mentor, Dr. Don Yoder, who was from the University of Pennsylvania and also one of the co-founders of the Kutztown Folk Festival. He did more than anybody else to really kind of capture an understanding of how this particular role of the powwow doctor changed over time. And I'm going to be showing some images tonight that actually come from documents that he had collected over a period of time. And here you can see a classic example of a Germanic home with a person sitting in front of the hearth. But this is a stereotype. Because, of course, many folks will think that within the community it's the elderly who are doing this practice, and that's not altogether true. The fact is that folklorists have found over time that the people who are performing powwow rituals are young and old, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, rural and urban. All the boundaries are blurred. Many times people, of course, automatically think, well, this is something from the backcountry. Not true. You find as much of this, if not more of it, in some urban centers, such as the city of York or even Reading. And in one case, you'll even find, of course, Allentown as well. So these are all very, very close to home for us. Now, the common cures that are typically addressed through powwow rituals are things like blowing burns. This is something I heard a little bit about when I was in York County. And this is when a person will blow 3 times over a burn, immediately after a person has a scald or a burn, and they will invoke the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit while blowing over the burn. This is an interesting thing because blowing at one point in time was also used in official Roman Catholic ritual during the baptism ritual. You would blow across the infant in order to exorcise any sort of negative influence or spirit that may be around the child. This is something from medieval practice that found its way into the present. Obviously, you won't see ministers doing that in the Lutheran Church anymore, but Martin Luther's original translation of the baptismal ritual incorporated things like this. So you'll sometimes see crossovers between folk ritual and officially sanctioned ritual within the church. Stopping blood is another common one that was done. Many times you'll find people use the verse Ezekiel 16:6 to stop blood. When I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, when thou wast in thy blood, live. And you would repeat that 3 times over the wound, and people believed that this would, of course, stop the flow of blood. One of the best stories that I've heard about this over time is a man I know from Charlottesville who told me that one day, and his father was a powwower, he told me it was on Mother's Day, and he was at the Charlottesville Hotel, which is today Haig's Restaurant, up along Route 78, and there was an interesting situation where a young woman was bussing so many tables, and she was really trying to keep up with the Mother's Day crowd, that she cut her hand, and she cut her hand really badly on a broken glass. They called the doctor, and the doctor, of course, was out to lunch with his mother, so he wasn't available that day. And her father took my friend's father took this girl aside, and what he did was he powwowed her cut, and the bleeding stopped. The doctor shows up about an hour later, and takes one look at what was left of her hand, and he approaches my friend's father and said in Pennsylvania Dutch, "Ik weet wat du hast," which means, "I know what you did," and the implication was, "I don't approve of it." And in some situations, you'll find competition between folk healers and doctors. Some doctors really did not approve of this kind of stuff. On the other hand, you'll also find some doctors who used it themselves, as I will show later on too. In addition to a lot of these other type of illnesses that people were curing, many times you'll find childhood illnesses, like thrush, for instance. And here's an example of a man who's curing a case of thrush, but he's not from Pennsylvania. He's from Georgia. And here's another example of how these rituals spread out over time and are not just relegated to one particular area. He's blowing into the mouth of the child in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. One interesting thing about that is the fact that in the late Middle Ages, people used to actually apply medicine to children this way. They would put powders, compounds, herbs into their hands and use it to blow it into the lungs of the child, or into the mouth region especially, for both ailments of the lungs or infections of the mouth, like thrush. So this is an interesting situation where you see the actions being repeated even without the original intention involved. There's no medicine in the hand of this person. He believes that it's his words and his invocations of divine powers that's going to be interceding on behalf of this child. And obviously here he's also demonstrating. This child's giggling and finding it very funny. A kid who would actually be suffering from thrush would probably not be giggling and laughing and smiling. These last two illnesses are things that maybe you've heard of before: liver groan or opnema. These are what are considered culturally bound illnesses, and these are illnesses that outside of Pennsylvania Dutch culture you might not have heard of. Now, liver groan is the perception that you're getting cramps in your abdomen, because the perception was that your liver was actually attaching itself to the body cavity, that it wasn't just a free-hanging organ, that it was actually growing fast. And this is an interesting situation because in the dialect they use the word augavaksa, which literally means that it's growing together. And that's where this idea of liver grown comes from. But you'll even see this in the Shenandoah Valley. In English, people refer to it as hidebound. And it's the same illness, and folk healers have treated it in a bunch of different ways over the years. But this is one thing that's considered a culturally bound illness. The same with opnema, which literally means the takeoff or the wasting away. Marasmus is often used as an equivalent of it, but even that's not quite right, because this often blends elements of depression in with it too. A person who's wasting away, a person who won't eat, a person who can't sleep, a person who can't work, a person who literally and physically is wasting, in addition to also having many different types of disturbances, both mentally and spiritually. There are a lot of different types of rituals for addressing that. And these are all, believe it or not, considered fairly simple illnesses for a powwower to address. More complex ones are still used in the present day by some powwowers. Chronic pain management, to remove pain that otherwise a person may have to be on heavy medications. I've known of some folks who are powwowed in the present day by powwowers still living in Berks County to counter out chronic pain. Things like arthritis or even terminal illness are sometimes things that are used, that powwow is used to treat. Terminal illness, for instance, in some cases, of course, may not be curable, but a powwower may be called in to help alleviate some of the suffering of a person. And oftentimes a sense of comfort is derived from this because, of course, we have to remember these rituals, again, are bringing people together, and it's something that's familiar for many people. It reminds them of their family, of their home, of their culture, and also of a much greater sense of where their place is in the world. It helps to make illness not just a personal thing, but it also makes it a part of a community experience. And when we're sick, of course, the community around us experiences it as well. So this is an important thing as we're approaching these types of ritualized behaviors. The last thing on here is something that's also very complex, and it deals with some cultural perceptions surrounding the idea of a curse or a hex. Now, this word hex in Pennsylvania Dutch means both a curse, but it can also be the person who places a curse, and it could be the word used for a witch. So these do deal with some beliefs that have tapered off over the years. There are not many people today who believe that there are witches in every community who are out to cause calamity, misfortune, and illness. That's something that really has kind of passed out of most imaginations of people locally. Not to say that it was entirely imaginary, because there were people who also believed themselves to be witches, and people who were well aware of that in times past. It's very well documented. But the fact is that this idea of a curse is something that many people think of, and it can be intentional or unintentional. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too. First, I want to talk about this idea of who is actually doing this kind of work. Who's blowing for burns? Who's reciting Ezekiel 16:6 for stopping of blood? Who is doing this kind of thing? And there are two different types of powwowers that you'll find. There are some powwowers who, of course, are family powwowers. They only will powwow for someone within their own immediate family, maybe extended family, and maybe sometimes the neighbors. Then there are people who might be seen as professionals. I've got two folks up here from the mid-19th century that stand out to me as some pretty interesting examples. Sophia Baylor is the woman who's on the left up here. She used to actually do demonstrations of powwow at the Kutztown Folk Festival in the 1950s when it first got started. She's one of the people who helped raise awareness about this cultural practice. And she used to primarily deal with children's ailments and also primarily for her family and for people right in her local town. But she wasn't really a professional per se. There were some folks that people really looked at as being on the same class as a physician. And in fact, some powwowers at one point in time were licensed because you could actually apply for a medical license at one point in time, regardless of whether you had any schooling. And that was still the case well up until the very early 20th century. And this was something that medical associations fought against because they wanted to make sure they could clarify that if someone was going to visit a person they believed to be a doctor, that they were able to identify what kind of care they should expect. Because not everybody was completely aware of that. Some folks would visit a doctor and expect to be powwowed, and some people would go and visit a powwower and expect to get conventional medicine. And obviously, these are very different things, two ends of the spectrum. The man that you're seeing up here on the right is a man by the name of Dennis Rex, who was from Slaydale, Lehigh County. And you'll notice I pronounced that the way people pronounce it locally. Not Slatedale, it's Slaydale. And Dennis Rex used to actually have a medicine wagon. He traveled around to perform his cures. He was actually brought in at one point in time under trial for practicing medicine without a license. I know his grandson and his great-grandson, and they shared this photo with me of their ancestor. And it's an interesting situation because he was brought to trial, and his lawyer was very clever. His lawyer said, you need to dismiss all the charges against this man, for what he's doing is something it's cultural and it's religious. And people said, well, he's practicing medicine without a license. And what ended up happening was the lawyer said, well, if you throw him in jail for this, you're going to have to round up every Christian scientist all throughout this part of Pennsylvania as well. And that's going to be a really big task. Because what they were saying was you were setting a precedent. If you're going to take a person who's applying religious beliefs for the purpose of healing, you got to apply that all across the board. You can't just pick on one person. So they dismissed his trial because of the fact that the judge recognized that there was some truth to this. And he continued to practice folk medicine unhindered by the law. But this was an interesting precedent that was set in Lehigh County. Now, there were several people over the years who really drew the attention of the press. One man was Dr. Joseph Heinrich Hogan from Reading, Pennsylvania. He was such a prominent powwower and also folk physician in his area. He not only wrote out charms that were to be put on a person's body, he would actually write out these lengthy prayers, and then he would sew them into little linen bags or into little leather bags, and he would have them pinned onto the shirt of infants and adults alike. He often had a lot of people coming to him for childhood ailments. And so there were many, many babies all throughout Reading who were suffering from minor ailments who would be wearing these. And around the time of 1900, there was an expose that was in one of the oldest newspapers that had been printed in the United States up until that point, the North American newspaper, and it was printed in Philadelphia. And there was a big expose that basically said this man is a fraud and he is preying upon all of the local people. Well, Dr. Hogan was so upset about this that he got all of his friends and neighbors to come to his aid and attend his trial in Philadelphia, and their stories were all the same. Most of these people were women. Most of them were saying that we brought our child to Dr. Hogan because we had already visited a doctor, and the doctor said I couldn't do anything. So these folks were saying conventional medicine had essentially failed them. The doctors were saying, I can't help you. I don't know what's going on, which could have been a cultural thing again. There might have been a different perception of what was happening with the illness. In some cases, the babies were pronounced terminally ill. and Dr. Hageman treated them and they improved. So you can see how some people might build a level of trust in him, whether or not you believe that his techniques were effective or not. He, of course, all of these little bundles of charms were actually prayers, invocations, considered especially holy inscriptions. You'll see INRI for Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judiorum on the front of this little bag that was created for Emma Jane Widener, who was from Reading. It's a fascinating thing to see these, and these are still turning up. They're not something that are just in the past. He was making these up until the time of his death in 1905. And it's a good possibility some of these will still continue to turn up in family Bibles. I also had the opportunity to examine his family Bible from one of his descendants fairly recently, Thomas Gable, from the Reading area. And he let me look at his Bible, and of course, Ezekiel 16:6 had a little cross put right next to it, because that was something that Dr. Hageman was using for stopping blood. So this is another interesting opportunity of things that turn up in families. There's another woman from Reading who also got a lot of press, and some very positive press, believe it or not. At the same time that Dr. Hageman was being called a fraud and a charlatan, and at the same time the press was fond of calling Reading the little city of witches, Hexastadel, in the dialect. They actually printed that word and said, oh, everybody thinks of Reading as Hexastadel, the little city of witches. Catherine Hess and Catherine Ebert were two PowWowers from Reading who had wonderful reputations. Both of them were known during their life as Die Wurstfrau, which literally means the sausage lady. And that was because Catherine Hess had actually, she had emigrated to the United States, and she was arriving here, and her husband got sick, and within a couple of years actually died. So she was a widow right after arriving in Pennsylvania. She married a butcher in Reading, one of the few people who was making traditional bag bologna at that point in time, and she would go around and actually deliver these to people. So in addition to doing her powwowing, she was widely known as the person who delivered the sausages, so everybody called her the sausage lady. And there were two generations of sausage ladies, because her daughter did the same thing. And the original Catherine actually did not teach her daughter. She taught her daughter's husband, so her daughter's husband could teach her daughter Catherine. And this is a common thing that you'll find among the Pennsylvania Dutch, is that you don't learn it from a member of the same sex. When it's taught from a man to a woman and from a woman to a man. We don't know exactly why this is, but what we do know is that among the Pennsylvania Dutch, women and men were considered to be equally prominent healers. There was no concentration of power among men or among women. It was their sense of equality throughout the practice. And this is something you see in and through the narrative of the Hess-Ebert family, because they were so popular. And one of them, the younger, at one point in time was interviewed by the paper, and she said, as to powwowing, that it was a silent prayer to the Almighty, asking his aid and mercy based on certain portions of Scripture and short addresses in the German language, known to only a few, and which are seldom written, but handed down orally from generation to generation. There are words especially arranged for burns, scalds, blood diseases, bleeding, and kindred other ailments. Rarely will you find such a coherent story and such a coherent definition in any form of literature, much less a newspaper, which is often known to print pretty much anything. Here's a wonderful opportunity to see a person in their own words saying what it was that they were doing. There were even correspondents from the New York Times who were picking up on these stories, and there were correspondents who said they had visited her and been treated by her. So you had positive as well as negative in the public eye. Now, as I mentioned, of course, this process of learning from a man to a woman and from a woman to a man is something that was extremely important for local people. Folks even believed that if you kind of deviated from that, there was something really wrong with you, or that somehow calamity would befall, or that even worse, you might not actually be able to use what it is that you've been taught. You might not be any good at it. This, of course, is something that some folks were believed to be talented at, and some folks weren't. And it wasn't anything that was anybody's fault. It was believed that some people did a better job communicating with the divine forces and being able to channel them for the purpose of healing. And oftentimes a great sense of discretion goes along with this. Not just anybody was taught. It was something that, of course, was a person who was going to take it seriously, and a person who was going to honor the tradition and honor the person who taught them. This is so important. And oftentimes you'll find in families, for this reason, it skips a generation. Many times you'll find that if a parent offers to teach a child, even if that child's now an adult and grown up, they'll say, you know what, times are changed, Mom, I don't want to learn this stuff. And people will be dismissive and say, you know, I'm not interested. And that's okay. But you'll often find the inverse being true, where if a grandparent offers to teach a granddaughter or grandson, that they will be really interested. Because let's face it, we don't often take advice from our parents, but we'll take that advice from our grandparents. So there is a sense to which you'll find that it skips a generation. And this, of course, is something where most people have been, at one point in time, forbidden to write it down. As you saw from Catherine Ebert's account, she said, this is rarely written down. This is only, of course, something that was learned by word of mouth and passed from generation to generation. This is so important because the writing of PowWow charms became something really important in the 19th century, and I should argue it kind of always was, but many people considered these to be private writings, things that they would keep secret, because again, they were honoring this tradition. The wholesale publishing and printing of this kind of material was something at one point in time that had a strong taboo attached to it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that publishing too, and how people looked somewhat negatively upon that, even though they might look very positively on the oral transmission of this particular tradition. Now, oftentimes if a person is being powwowed, you could find that there were particular rituals for each illness. There also are overall rituals that could be used if the source of the illness was not known, or if a person, for instance, wanted to have their entire person treated. And typically, what was done is that a person would sit in a chair. They would face east. Many powwowers would hand the person a Bible. Some powwowers would even say, do you believe? This was a common thing at one point in time. It might not be the most common thing anymore. And of course, you don't have to necessarily be a Christian in order to be powwowed. However, there were some folks who made that mandatory. Not every folk practitioner felt that that was important. But at one point in time, this was the general procedure. You would sit in a chair facing east. The person would actually draw their hands over your entire body, blessing each individual part, pulling out inflammation, putting blessing into each individual part, and sealing it with the sign of the cross. This was a very common thing, and in some situations, you'll even find that there were specific chairs used by practitioners for this purpose. And there is such a chair at the museum in historic Schaefferstown at the Thomas Brendel Museum that was owned and operated. This particular chair was used and operated by a man in the Lancaster County area. Now, some folks, of course, will ask, is this faith healing? And one of the most important aspects that makes it different from faith healing, even though a lot of the references are biblical references within some of these prayers. Saints are invoked, Christ is invoked, the Holy Trinity is invoked. It sounds a lot like faith healing. One of the biggest differences is that in faith healing, many times there is a sense of conversion experience that takes place. Oftentimes a person is healed as the result of some form of change within their person and faith. Not necessarily in all cases, but this is something that is largely absent from powwow. Most people are not being converted in any way, shape, or form. There's no proselytizing. These particular rituals were something that most people believed to be effective, and it wasn't about what you believed per se theologically. Many people believed, however, that you maybe had to have certain beliefs in the practice itself, or belief in yourself, or believe in the practitioner. There's a lot of different perceptions of this, but there are many people, however, who look at Christ as being the role model for the powwower. To some folks, that might seem a little bit insulting, because not everybody necessarily thinks about folk medicine as being something that can be interwoven with officially sanctioned religion. But the fact is, among the Pennsylvania Dutch, people took it very seriously that Christ was a healer. And if you read the Gospel of Mark in German, a lot of the procedures that Christ is using, healing with words, is very, very similar to what you see among powwowing in Pennsylvania. Now, this question of must I believe in order to work is such an important thing, because when you think about powwowers, powwowing children, what sort of belief must a child have in order to receive this kind of healing? An infant, or even in some cases, what about veterinary powwow, which was also very popular? Does a horse have to believe in order for it to receive healing? This makes the whole thing a little bit muddled. Now, some people will say, well, it's not the horse that has to believe, it's the horse's owner that has to believe, or it's not the child that must believe, it's the child's parents. Now, this really flies in the face of the idea of what many people might think of as belief-based healing, where you're believing that something's going to work and therefore it does. Some folks will call this placebo in a conventional medicinal sense. This flies in the face of the placebo effect if a parent believes that it's going to work and it works for a child who may not have any belief one way or the other. Clearly something more is at work here, and it's not so easy to really kind of put this into a nice little box and say, there it is, it only works because people believe in it. that. This has even been done for folks who are either A, not Christians or not part of the cultural experience, who have no experience with these particular rituals to begin with, but say, well, I'm open-minded to it. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this. One of the things I have, of course, up here is Sophia Baylor, the Tremont, Schuylkill County PowWower that I mentioned before. And here she's actually showing a healing ritual she's performing on a child, using a piece of string to draw out an illness. I've got an image of a Bible here too, because my grandfather often told me that when he was PowWowed as a child, he was expected to hold this massive folio Bible. Even as a little kid, he was like 4 and being PowWowed because he wasn't putting on weight fast enough, and they thought maybe he had something wrong with him. They took him to the PowWower down the street, and he had to hold this Bible that was so big, he felt that during the time that he had to hold it, he was afraid he was going to fall over because it was one of those massive folio family Bibles that are so common in this area. And it's fascinating to see the way in which this aspect of belief is interwoven with it. Some folks really stressing the religious aspects, some folks not at all. I've known some PowWowers who were not churchgoers whatsoever. So there really is kind of a mixed bag. But I do want to mention this idea of the horse again, this idea of veterinary medicine. This is a really interesting thing. I found many situations where you'll find PowWow stories relating to work on the farm. There are many different ailments among horses and cows that were believed to be treated especially very effectively by PowWow. I know a nice example, this idea of the stopping of blood, like I mentioned, that was done for the young lady on Mother's Day. I've got a nice example from Lebanon County. When some cows were being dehorned. This is one of the most common times that a PowWower would be called to come to a farm. And they would use the very same ritual process that they would use for people, they would also use it on the cows. I have a nice example of this that was shared with me. There was a woman from around the Schaeferstown area in Lebanon County, and she said, oh yeah, we had the PowWower called out when we were dehorning some cow. We had 3 cows that the horns wouldn't stop bleeding when they were cut. And she said, the PowWower said to everybody present, now hey, anybody who doesn't believe in this has got to walk away. And everybody stayed, and she PowWowed 2 of the cows, and they were fine, and the 3rd one she was having problems with, and she turned and faced everybody and said, there's somebody here who's blocking me from being able to do this. Somebody here doesn't believe in what's going on, and I need them to leave. And of course, the father left, and he did not believe in it. He thought it was something outside of his interest. And the cow, of course, recovered after the father left. Some people will use this as an example of the idea that one must believe. But we're really dealing with some nebulous concepts about how the belief of one person present could in some way even affect a cow. It goes to show that the way is that many people think that folks are interrelated, both with their environment, with the animals they have on their farm, with the cosmos, in the case of the moon during the time of the healing with the potato. You'll find many different types of crossovers in beliefs about how all aspects of material existence and the living world are interconnected. One thing I will mention as well that's so important is that one of the earliest known pieces of written language in German is an early charm. In fact, one of the earliest pieces. And it's known as the Merseburg Zauberspruch, which literally means the magic words from Merseburg. And it recalls this idea of mending a sprain on a horse. And the very same charm shows up in Pennsylvania. And oftentimes, they'll use this particular charm from bone to bone, from marrow to marrow, or something along those lines. In this case, I've got a nice example from Berks County from around 1800 that says, from bone to the marrow, from the bone to the tendon to the flesh, from the flesh to the skin, from the skin to the hair, from the hair into a stone 50 fathoms deep. And what is happening here is they're drawing the illness out of the horse into a stone, and then they're casting it into a body of water. This particular ritual is something that actually comes even from the 11th century. You can see how long this has been among German-speaking people. And here's an example of this particular European charm. Originally it said, and this is how it was originally put, if we translate it into English, it says, Foal and Woden were riding into the woods, and the foot of Balder's foal was sprained. So Sinthgund, Sunna's sister, conjured it, and Freya, Vola's sister, conjured it, and Woden conjured it as well as he could. Like bone sprain, so blood sprain, so joint sprain, bone to bone, blood to blood, joints to joints, so may they be mended. Now, who are all these people that they're talking about in this charm? Who are these characters? These are actually mythological characters that are coming from the Germanic pantheons of gods and goddesses. This is because this particular charm isn't originally even Christian. However, you'll find just a couple centuries later, people are using the same charm, only Christ is doing the healing. Jesus rode to the heath. There he rode the leg of his colt in two. Jesus dismounted and healed it. Jesus laid marrow to marrow, bone to bone, flesh to flesh. Jesus laid there on a leaf, that it might remain in the same place. You can see that what is common here is that the belief that words have the opportunity to provide a healing comfort is the common belief here. I'm not saying that all of these charms are originally pagan. That's not true. But the fact is that there are some similarities and continuities of belief from earlier stages of the culture's development, even up until the present day. Now, all this might sound a little controversial, so of course many people will ask, what does this have to do with the way people feel religiously? You've talked about Jesus, you've talked about the Germanic gods. What does this really mean for people? And of course, many folks will ask, what do the clergy think about this? What would my pastor think if he heard about this kind of material? The fact was, at one point in time, there were pastors who powwowed. There was a pastor who was actually serving congregations in Berks and Schuylkill. He was a circuit minister, which means he would go from church to church. He served about half a dozen congregations, and he was really an elder within the Lutheran Church, and his name was Reverend George Menning. And he was actually responsible for not only using these rituals, but also writing them down. And this is an interesting situation because he would publish them and then give them out to his congregation members because he believed that this type of healing was directly related to his faith. There's, of course, no right answer to this. You'll find some ministers in the late 19th century condemning this and saying that there's really something wrong with this. This is not our church beliefs, but it does depend on who you talk to. Now, one of the interesting things is that this particular ritual that I just showed in the last slide, it says "Fürs Wildfeuer." Pfarrer Mennig's Kur fürs Wildfeuer means Pastor Mennig's cure for wildfire. The very same ritual was being used in the 1950s. And now given, this man, of course, was born in the 18th century and served in Pennsylvania up until the mid-19th century. Here we've got a woman in Schuylkill County in the 20th century using the exact same ritual in Schuylkill County, not too far from where Menning originally was publishing this material. And she was using a piece of string to pull the illness out of a child. And she would say, "Wildfire, wildfire, flee, flee, flee. The red thread chases you away, away, away." Only she would say it in Pennsylvania Dutch. She would say, "Wilde fire, wilde fire, flee, flee, flee. De rode faden, jagte he. And she would draw the string over the body of the child, and she would smoke it over the hearth. And then she would hang it up right above her stove, and when it would fall of its own accord, the illness would be gone. She would then dispose of it in the hearth or into her stove. Now, the interesting thing is we actually have examples of this in the 18th century in Berks County as well, where a person's doing exactly this, only they're hanging it in the chimney, and when it falls of its own accord. So you can see, even though the technology is changing, the beliefs are constant. This is such an important thing to see. Times change, whether or not we're talking about Christian or pagan times, or even ovens versus hearths and chimneys. We're talking about change happening in culture, but a continuity of beliefs that is present nonetheless. And here's an example of this from Berks County, from a man by the name of Conrad Raber, who lived in Tulpehocken, and currently his farm is now under the Blue Marsh Dam. So his place can no longer be visited, but he's buried up on the hill at Frieden's Church right nearby. And he introduces this idea of saying, "Wildfire, wildfire, zing, zing, zing." And then he says, "Flick, flick, flick," as his words, as the charm that's being used. Now, I have an explanation for this because you see zing, zing, zing in other sources as well. It's actually a contraction of the words "Zieh an dein Gift, zieh an dein Gift, zieh an dein Gift," which means withdraw your poison, withdraw your poison, withdraw your poison. And this was very commonly used in the language where you talk to the illness and you draw it out. You're actually calling it by name and asking it to depart. And flick, flick, flick is short for fliegeweg, fliegeweg, fliegeweg. So whenever you find things in powwow that look like magic words, oftentimes they may actually have a root in some form of original language that may have been abbreviated or abridged or condensed. Now, the most common texts that most people were using for powwowing are not powwow books per se. It's the Holy Bible and the Almanac. Typically, you'll find verses from Scripture being used, just as I mentioned with Ezekiel 16:6. But the Almanac was the reference you would use, especially to make sure you were treating things at the right time, because it's believed that the moon would help you. And of course, the idea of using a potato to take away a wart and looking at the moon while you're doing it. The waxing moon must be present. The belief, of course, is that the moon, the action of the moon, is what helps to pull the wort away into the potato. The belief is as the moon is starting to wax, it's actually pulling a force away from the earth. As the moon wanes, it's putting it into the earth. And these mechanics, this aspect of away from and towards, are being used very frequently in PowWow ritual. Now, I mentioned this idea of course, biblical symbolism coming up in many different types of charms, and some of these are very, very specific. This particular one from 1837 from Lebanon County begins, Und Gott hat alles erschaffen, was im Himmel und auf Erden ist, und alles war gut, nicht allein die Schlange, Gott hat verflucht. Verflucht sollst du bleiben, Schlange, geschwolst, ich stelle dich. Gift und Schmerz, ich date dich. Zieh an dein Gift, zieh an dein Gift, zieh an dein Gift. And it says, and God created everything that was on earth and in heaven, and everything was good except for the snake, which he cursed. And cursed shall you remain, snake. You're actually talking to a snake after the snake has bitten a person. And it says, swelling and pain, I stop thee. Poison and pain, I destroy thee. Withdraw thy poison, withdraw thy poison, withdraw thy poison. You're actually talking about, in this case, a divine arrangement, a cosmological arrangement. Christ, and of course, God created this world according to this particular set of beliefs, so you're asking for divine forces to intercede on behalf of a person's well-being. And this is part of a cosmological and religious set of symbols that are being used in these situations. This is so very important for understanding the worldview of how people believed that this stuff was going to work. To them, it was part of a much broader sense of self and placement in the cosmos. Now, I mentioned this word hexerai as well, and this word of cursing, this idea that in the past, many people believed that cursing took place in these communities as well, which of course is an aberration within this idea of a divine world and cosmos. This is something that's very controversial because, of course, what happens if a person curses you? You're going to feel resentment and anger and all kinds of things if you perceive that that took place. And of course, how will you know? So of course it's seen as very unethical for people to participate either in cursing or to participate in accusations concerning cursing. And this goes back to Europe, of course, where many, many people were burned at the stake because they were believed to be witches during the Middle Ages. Nearly 1 million people were burned at the stake throughout the Rhine River Valley, where the Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry was originally coming from. Those folks who were emigrating here had this as part of their history in the past. So they knew that this idea of accusing people for witchcraft was not a good idea. Typically in PowWow, there are non-invasive ways of dealing with what you might perceive to be a curse. And of course, it is just a perception in the end. So this, however, does have the effect to really affect people's health. And one story I'd like to tell you about this is the fact that I have a friend who is nearly 70 today, who told me that when she was a child, she was considered cursed, and she had a developmental disorder. When she was nearly 2, she had not begun to speak or to walk. And her parents were very seriously concerned. And they called the doctor. They had actually called the doctor by the time that she was 1 because they suspected there was something that was not quite right. And the doctor said, I don't know what to do. She seems healthy in every respect. We'll just wait and see. But as she got closer and closer to 2 years, the parents got more and more nervous. And when the doctor basically said, I can't help you, I don't know, we're going to have to sit and wait this out, that was when they called in the PowWower. And the PowWower said, there's something that's affecting this child. She said, in fact, there's something that's very close to the child that's causing this. And they said, well, what's the problem? And they said, well, the PowWower said, is there something the child is carrying with them or something the child uses on a day-to-day basis? They said, well, there is that stuffed rabbit that she likes. And of course, the stuffed rabbit was brought forward. And they said, where did she get the stuffed rabbit? And of course, they explained, well, it was the neighbor lady down the street. And then the story comes out. Who's this neighbor lady? Well, the neighbor lady was a former sweetheart of the father. And of course, the PowWower said, you need to burn that rabbit. The perception was that without intending to do so, the neighbor lady had given this gift with a sense of jealousy and envy involved, and that a person's emotions have the ability to reside within an object that's given as a gift and to affect that person's well-being. So when they burned the rabbit, by the end of the week, the young girl was actually starting to show some signs of change. By the time she was going to kindergarten, she was entirely caught up with her peers. So it's an interesting story. And the person I was talking to, of course, highly educated. She herself became a teacher and an educator, had a master's degree. It's a fascinating thing to think about this sort of stuff and to wonder about, what really was going on there. But she, of course, believed that this is what had happened to her. This was her experience, and this was her parents' experience. The belief here is that curses can happen not just from some mythical character of a witch, but just from the idea that a person might wish someone else ill. And if you wish someone else ill, it has the effect to hurt someone else or to harm them. In the case of burning the stuffed rabbit, nobody was injured. But that's not always the case in some of these situations. In the past, there were other ways that people dealt with this kind of thing that was not always quite so savory. But this word hexerai implies any of these types of cursing practices, whether they are intentional or unintentional, and especially in the case where you'll find a person who's known as a hex. In the 19th century, this was very common, that there was people in the countryside that folks assumed might have been wishing other people ill and using ritual to do so, and inflicting harm, either for amusement or for monetary remuneration. I have some examples. One's actually from my personal collection, instructions for how to get rid of a witch. And it describes how to make a little gingerbread cookie that looks just like the person that you suspect of being the witch. And then you're supposed to shoot at it with a dime that you've loaded into a shotgun. And it's got to be a silver dime, one of those old mercury dimes. And you got to call the person by name. And it says it in the actual instructions. You got to call them by name, George or Molly or whatever their name is. I'm shooting you in the left arm, and you got to shoot them. And this is horrible, because the belief is you're injuring the person vicariously by means of a cookie. How terrible is that? Cookies are supposed to be good. They're not supposed to be something that's horrible. So this is an opportunity to see the way in which not everybody felt the same way about these types of cursing practices. And part of the controversy around this is part of why people feel so uncomfortable. I can see some people moving in their seats as I'm talking about this topic. And it's because these are beliefs that oftentimes have not continued into the present day because of how uncomfortable they are. Most people who believe in this sort of thing today are believing that it's largely unintentional if a person receives a curse, not something so intentional. The piece I also have up here that's on the right is a barn blessing that was used when it was perceived that a person had cast some form of either evil eye or some form of curse upon some cows. And it was written in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit to guard the flesh and blood of these cows between 1820 and 1831. It was only good for 4 years. So it's possible that the person who was creating these might have been paid every 4 years to make a new one for the person, or it could mean that they really believed that that period of 4 years had some sort of spiritual significance. We'll never really know, but this was a piece that was owned by Alfred Shoemaker, who was one of the founders of the Kutztown Folk Festival. And now, what do doctors think of all this? Doctors have always been very skeptical of this idea of cursing. But in and through the beliefs here in this area, you'll find circumstances where doctors are actually using PowWow practices. I actually have a doctor's ledger from the 1830s that actually gives all sorts of PowWow instructions right inside it, and he was a highly educated medical doctor. And one of the things that he has in this particular book is the war cure. And he goes on to talk about the idea of everything I see, may it increase, and what I touch, may it decrease. Very similar to what I told you before. The only difference is this is written down, and I learned it by word of mouth. And he says this has got to be spoken 3 times, especially in the last Friday of the full moon. And the belief is, of course, that full moon is going to use that force pulling away from the earth to remove the wart. The interesting thing about this particular piece, however, is that he uses an abbreviation for in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and it's PF et SS. How many of you took any Latin? In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, this particular doctor was probably Roman Catholic. And it's believed that some of these types of rituals may have actually originally come from Roman Catholic practices. However, it's not necessarily certain. In this case, there were many Roman Catholics in the Oli Valley who were German-speaking, and this man may have been one of them, and that's the origin of this particular ledger. But this idea of the moon being used to help with the removal of illness is also something that you'll find in that idea I mentioned earlier about plugging illness into a tree. I have some instructions from the 19th century that talk about the idea of taking a goose quill, and you've got to cut it off where it begins to be hollow, and you scrape a little bit off of your nails. In this case, they didn't have nail clippers back then, or at least this person didn't, because he talks about scraping his nails. So he's removing a little bit of each nail from the hands and the feet, he says in this particular set of instructions. He uses the word the feet, and he says you're to put it inside of the quill, and then you're to bore a hole in a tree that bears no fruit, And you're to tuck that in there, and the hole has to be facing the rising sun, and it has to be done in the first Friday in the new moon, and it has to be done in the morning. And the belief, of course, is that you're going to then take a bung made of pine wood, it instructs, and with 3 strokes of the hammer in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, you're to actually plug this up, and then, of course, you're committing the illness into the tree. Now, why is he using the new moon in this circumstance? It's because the new moon was believed to push something in or towards. So you're taking it out of the person, and you're putting it into the tree, as opposed to the full moon when it's pulling it out of the person. There's 2 different ways of using the moon as assisting with your healing rituals. And there actually are examples of where trees have been either cut down or uprooted, where you find evidence of this kind of material. And there is a tree, or a cross-section of a tree, that's in the Thomas Brendel Museum in Schaefferstown, showing exactly this particular process. And this tree was from right around the border between Berks, Lebanon, and Lancaster. And in some situations, just like that Conrad Raber fellow I talked about from Tulpehocken, in one of his diaries, he incorporated this idea of using it even in the making of physical compounds. You have the moon being present. He talks about making something called a plaster. Nowadays, most doctors are not using plasters, except in the use of casts. But in the past, people used to make plasters to go on the skin. It would actually heal over any sort of skin ailment that was open, or even a wound in some cases. And many times they were believed to both administer healing properties inwards and then also pull illness out. And he talks about making a plaster out of a handful of fallen clean grain seed, a handful of earthworms, and a pound of butter that was all mixed together and all baked together, and then you slather it on the person. You have to do that in 3 Fridays in succession in the witness of the moon as it waxes and wanes. And if you look very carefully here, you'll see that he actually has zu, full, und ab. As the moon waxes, to, full, and wanes. And zu-nehmen and abnehmen are the words in Standard German for waxing and for waning. And you can see the way he actually has the moon as part of the instructions here. This was something at one point in time that was so popular, even in some circumstances, of course, for planting and for harvesting and many other aspects of agricultural life, that I'm seeing some nods of the heads because folks remember when this was still done, the idea of planting by the moon. Very, very important stuff in the past. Now, these types of rituals also offer, in addition to thinking about these forces of cosmological impact, this idea of the moon and the cosmos, it also gives you an opportunity to examine some of the most unique forms of beliefs among the Pennsylvania Dutch. In addition to other things I've talked about, there are some marginal religious beliefs that used to be practiced among the Pennsylvania Dutch that aren't so much anymore. At one point in time, people believed in a spirit known as Sophia. And this might sound like some newfangled ideas, but at one point in time, in the Ephrata area, there was quite a lot of interest in this particular figure who was believed to be the feminine aspect of the Holy Spirit and also the spirit of healing that you'll see showing up in some of these types of documents. This particular piece was found in an 18th century family Bible. It depicts a feminine angel, a winged head, identified as the spirit of Sophia or the spirit of wisdom. And you'll see with her is a crown, a burning heart, and then also a circle with the Star of David in it, and then all of the symbols of the 7 planets within the points of the star. You'll see the name Adonai along the side, another Hebrew name for God, as well as 3 crosses, and again, I-N-R-I, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judiorum, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This was folded up and carried by a person in their prayer book or family Bible, and the purpose was for protection. It's an interesting thing to see this kind of visual imagery cropping up in addition to all the words that are often shown in some of these texts. Now, I did mention that there were books that were published, and I don't want to cover too much about this because there's a lot been written on the subject. But at one point in time, there was a famous book printed in 1820 by John George Holman. He was a man who was a PowWower himself, but he was not a man of super high repute. Not everybody thought the best of him. He was chronically ill for one, and some people thought of him as a bit of a capitalist when it came to being able to sell these types of traditional beliefs for a profit. And he wrote the book called The Long Lost Friend. It was first printed in Reading. Some people loved the book, some people didn't. It has a mixed review in its history. But interestingly enough, he claims that these healing rituals prove the existence of God. because of course, if they're being performed and they're working, what else could be behind them? Kind of a bold statement. He was a Roman Catholic, and he was about 1% of the original immigrants to Pennsylvania who were Roman Catholic. Most people coming this way were Protestant. So it's an interesting thing to see this marginal character and how great of an impact he had, because you'll find this book all throughout the Dutch country. It was printed by the hundreds of thousands, especially coming out of places like Reading and Harrisburg, and it's one of the most popular books in the Dutch country. But not everybody who had one was actually practicing PowWow, because he was a very good salesman, and he knew that when he put a certain inscription on the inside of his book that said that anybody who carries this book will be safe from all dangers, safe from all their enemies, will not perish by drowning or in a fire or from lightning or any calamity or from firearms or weapons. And it's a big, long list of all the things that you will not be harmed by. If you carry this book, you can understand why so many people bought it and carried it with them. And this particular edition is about only this big, so it's big enough to fit in a breast pocket. And I have several copies of this, and I know many people locally have copies that were passed down through the generations within their family. If your book has all kinds of little marginal annotations in it, chances are someone was using it. If it's a nice clean copy that doesn't look like it had any use, chances are someone just thought that it was something important to have around. So it's interesting. And he attributes many of his charms and his prayers in his book to a little book of the gypsies. He claims, in fact, he knows that he didn't write it. It was appropriated from material that had already been published in Europe. A little book called Das Romanes Buchlein, the little book of the gypsies, that goes back to the early 18th century. A lot of this kind of material, in order to increase its sellability, was attributed to other cultures. Some people will advertise, here's a healing method that comes from the gypsies. Or in this case, you'll also find the Jews, and they'll show pictures of the high priests from around the time of Christ. And these were all important selling points. But we have to remember that it was an opportunity for folks to look at other cultures, to look for exoticism. And this really enhanced the overall sellability of some of these materials. And that's part of why many people also kind of turned up their nose at this material and said, you know, this is a little bit strange, and this is a little bit too profit-driven. So this is an interesting thing as well. There were other works that were printed in this area as well. One book that was called Soli Deo Gloria that does not attribute any of its cures to the gypsies or to the Jews or to any other particular other extra-cultural influences. This particular one, however, attributes its cures to a gray man who appeared to the author and then vanished after teaching him the secrets of sympathy about how Christ healed with words. More of a work dealing with some aspects of faith healing, perhaps, than some of the other things I've talked about tonight. But this really runs the gamut of the kind of literature that's available on this subject. Most of it out there is still in German. There are a lot of things that had never been translated, but The Long Lost Friend was translated into English, and also another little book called The Friend in Need, which I recently translated as well, that's also available. One of the problems with these works was that once people were able to learn from books instead of learning from people face to face, you're starting to also see a breakdown in the community structure. Instead of thinking that what really the power is in the relationship of people and the relationship to the divine, people started looking at the book as being in and of itself a powerful thing. And sometimes this encouraged some rather bizarre behaviors, and sometimes insanity. There was a man in York County who was mentally ill. His wife had him thrown in an insane asylum because she was afraid of him. He had been a powwower when he was younger, but he had some problems, some pretty severe emotional problems that were not part of his practice. And he believed that he had been cursed, and he went around trying to figure out who had cursed him. You can see where this might go. Eventually, he was driven to a point where he believed so firmly that he was cursed that he killed a man because he believed he was trying to obtain the man's copy of Holman's book in order to break the power of the spell. This kind of material is not normal among the Pennsylvania Dutch. This is a marginal story dealing with one man who had a bit of a problem. I would say a little bit more than a bit of a problem. He actually left a mental institution, and no one pursued him after he left, because at that point in time, the mental institution was filled to bursting with people who needed treatment. In one way, you can look at this as a failure in the medical institution itself for not having kept this criminally insane person off the streets. But many people instead looked at it as, oh, those Pennsylvania Dutch, Look at those practices that they're encouraging. And this was used as an incident to shame the Pennsylvania Dutch, and it worked. For this reason, a lot of people didn't want to talk about PowWow anymore, and they especially didn't want to talk about it in English. When I learned a PowWow, I learned it in Pennsylvania Dutch, which I speak fluently. I did not learn it in English. And this is an interesting thing to the present, the way in which people are very secretive and guarding of this kind of stuff, because they're afraid of how other people might view them based on what they're thinking. After tonight, I hope you've been able to see a lot of the positive aspects of this practice, not just these kinds of marginal stories that happen to make it into newspapers, because of course, everybody knows the newspaper's not focused on all the good things that happens. The blood and the guts and the gore is what really sells, and this was one of those stories. And this was not the only incident that happened like this. There were a couple others. I have a friend over at the Schwenkfelder Museum, Candace Perry, who gives a great presentation on the way in which these isolated incidents were used as a broad network of material to shame the Pennsylvania Dutch. And that in fact, there were all kinds of stories written about the Hess murders sweeping across the nation, and it was a media sensation. And it blew over within like a decade. No one was talking about it anymore. But it was, again, one of those situations where the newspapers got an idea and they were going to run with it, regardless of whether they were doing any aspect of the story any justice, or whether they were actually condemning a cultural group of people. There was a lot of problems at that point in time in journalism, but you'll see that this type of thing is marginal. This is not a common experience among the Pennsylvania Dutch. And in fact, you'll find that in the present day, there are a lot of people who are interested in this idea of alternative medicine and really look at this in an entirely different way. They don't look at it as dangerous. In the time of the newspaper article I showed from York County, there were medical organizations that vowed that they would stamp out powwowing, that they would go door to door and try to round up the powwowers and put them in jail. This never happened because there's no way they ever could have done it. They would have been arresting everyone's grandmother and grandfather in most cases. It would have been impossible. And it also wouldn't have been ethical. It wouldn't have made any sense. But it is interesting to note that in the present day, there are folks who are studying, of course, the effects of alternative and complementary medicine. That is, forms other than conventional medicine that can be used to complement the medicine that is used by doctors in the present day. And some folks have even advocated that things like powwowing that are used within cultures, because many different cultures have folk healing, they've talked about this idea as it being used to complement conventional medicine, and if a person does this without interfering with any aspects of what their doctor's recommending, it can actually be really helpful to them. And what we found is that 70% of Americans are using alternative forms of medicine, whether they're going to a chiropractor or taking herbal supplements or things like that. Alternative medicine is real, and powwowing is one form of that. And the interesting thing about powwowing is that typically it's also a non-invasive thing. Nobody's going to do anything to physically hurt you. But again, I'm not advocating that people should go see a powwower. And oftentimes people will use it especially to obtain some form of a sense of comfort in the absence of any form of comfort that may be coming from conventional medicine. Some folks may say, every time I go to my doctor, he just wants to write me a prescription. He doesn't even really want to hear what I have going on. I had one person tell me that, and one person who also, he was actually seeing a powwower, and he said he felt better. Even though he knew his illness was not improving per se, his outlook on life was, because it was a tradition that was familiar to him, and it was part of his family's experience. It was part of his experience, and it treated the whole person, not just his physical body, but all aspects of his being. This is an important thing to think about when we're looking at the present day of powwow and what it means. Now, one thing I will mention, this is one of the last slides I have. There are a lot of folks who look at other aspects of Pennsylvania Dutch tradition and wonder, are those marks on the barns, are they part of this ritual tradition? And many people have compounded many different aspects of Pennsylvania Dutch culture to try to point to these ritual traditions. And perhaps for a good reason, because we know these ritual traditions are interwoven with many different aspects of life, whether it's domestic or agricultural, healing, or other things as well. I will tell you that I performed a survey of decorated barns starting in 2008, and am still doing it up until the present day, documenting all of the barns in Berks and Lehigh County that are visible from public roadways. The vast majority of people never thought that these designs on the barns had any immediate effect on their surroundings. There are some folks who will say yes, but the vast majority of people will say no. And in fact, they don't even use this word hex signs, which of course has a negative connotation if you're using the dialect. To the American imagination at large, there's no perception of what that word hex actually means. Because if you were to take that and literally take it apart, that means curse. You're talking about a curse there. Of course, some folks believe that these designs were put there to avert a curse or to stop witchcraft. And that was the type of idea that was particularly promulgated in the 1920s through the 1950s by tourist literature. You'll even find tourist literature that'll tell you that today. It's absolutely not true whatsoever. In fact, we can trace this to one particular author who published in the 1920s from New England. He wasn't even himself Pennsylvania Dutch. He was a man who was publishing a series of travel journals entitled The State's Beautiful Series. He wrote a book called Pennsylvania Beautiful, where he claimed to hear from one Lehigh County farmer. He traces it to Lehigh. He says that this was one Lehigh County farmer who told them that they were there to protect from witches, and he thought that that was good enough to put in a book. And ever since then, people have believed it. Prior to that time, everybody was using the word Stana to talk about these designs, which means stars. And again, you see the role of stars and the significance that the stars and the movements of the heavens have for people who are agricultural. Of course, they planted by those stars. They healed by those stars. They also depicted them in their artwork. And so the artwork ends up on the outside of the barn. I showed this barn blessing before that you see over here on the left. There's another one on the right, also showing some celestial and astrological symbolism, taking the divine order of the cosmos and using it in order to bless a barn. Both of these were found hidden, concealed inside of a barn. These are the things that PowWowers were doing to protect a barn, not painting on the outside. There were never any cases where anybody knows of a PowWower who also painted hex signs on a barn, at least not historically. There might be people present day who are doing it because they read it somewhere that this is a good idea. There might be a little bit of information out there too about some PowWowers who say, maybe you should put this design somewhere. I've heard that. But on the whole, you don't typically find much of this kind of material. There are some folks who refer to them as painted prayers. Maybe that can be so. But typically, that's not the story that you find in this region. Now, one thing I'll also mention, there are people who are still using this kind of material today. I have a friend from Oli who actually carried this personal concealed blessing with him, just like those barn blessings. He carried it in his shoe when he went to court. He actually had gotten unemployment because he felt he was improperly treated by his boss, and his boss took him to court over it. His boss lost because his boss had probably been mistreating him, but he carried this charm with him to assure that he was going to get proper treatment when he went into court. It's an interesting thing. There was actually a case of a mafia boss from New York who carried the exact same charm with him. It was published in the New York Times. That's how I know about this. And that person believed it was going to help him. Didn't help the mafia boss, though. Because apparently it's only going to help those people who are bearing false witness, which is what the actual cure says in the original German. And this particular piece has been known to have been found both in Pennsylvania and also in Europe. The piece that you see up on the right as well is a house blessing from Lenhartsville. It's a nice example of a piece that was actually derivative of Holman's book, a positive piece that you see that people would put this particular inscription that says INRI, Spiritus Sanctus, which means Holy Spirit, and then Das alles bevor it sei hier zeitlich und dort ewiglich. All this be protected here in time and there in eternity. And I've known people who found these folded up into little triangles tucked above windows and doorways in Berks and Lehigh County. They're out there, and sometimes you find them in historic houses. Now, my hope is after this evening, you'll see the way in which traditions have changed over the years, but you see a lot of continuity of belief from the time that people were arriving here in Pennsylvania, these beliefs that were brought from Europe with them that thrived in the New World. And of course, here in the United States, very early on, you'll see even in the colonial period, prior to the American Revolution, in the time of William Penn, there was a spirit of toleration about people's beliefs, and it persists to the present day. That's part of why you see the persistence of these particular traditions here in Pennsylvania, but not so much in Europe. So it's an interesting thing that was in the past in Europe, but it's still present here in PA. And my hope is that after this evening, you have a better idea about the origins of these traditions and why it's important to understand them. Even if you're not participating in them, even if you have no real interest in them, it's an important thing to know where we're coming from. It's an important thing to be able to connect with our ancestry, to connect with the traditions that define who we are, to give us a better idea, not just of how our ancestors viewed the workings of the world, but also about where we're going in the future and how we can be informed by our past. So I thank you all for coming out tonight, and I'm going to also take some questions too. Right here.
Is there any documentation, or do you have any documentation about the percentage of how the PowWow worked if they worked, if they didn't work?
Well, I never conducted a study like that, but there was one particular author who actually published a book through Penn State. His name is David Kriebel, and he actually worked with someone through one of the Hershey Medical Centers to do a study about the effect of PowWow. This particular person through Hershey was actually interested in the effect of prayer as well. And this is because in the 1980s there was a gentleman who actually proved statistically that people who are prayed for improve at a different rate than those who are not. There was actually a scientific study done about this, and what they did was they had a series of people who were recovering from heart ailments, people who had had heart attacks and had been treated for them. And they noted, they had one group of people who was being prayed for and one group of people who was not. And they noted statistically it was significant that the people who were being prayed for improved better. Now, I'm not a person who necessarily runs around saying that this is always going to work for people all the time. That isn't a study that I conducted, so I don't really know much about it, other than the fact that there are people who say that it's been clinically proven that people who are having some sort of additional interaction in their life, that it's statistically plausible, that it's helping them. This particular author, David Kriebel, who published a book called PowWowing in Pennsylvania, it was called PowWowing Among the Pennsylvania Dutch, that's what it was called. He specifically stated that from the statistics of the people that he interviewed, he asked, did it help? And he was, of course, asking folks who even were recalling stories from grandparents or great-grandparents, did it work? Almost everybody said yes. So he believed, at least from a folkloric perspective, when you're collecting oral history, statistics show that people perceived that it worked. So there's been no real study in the present day showing people being powwowed in a control group and similar ailments for people who are maybe not being powwowed. There's been no study done like that. But at least we can say that there are some folks who've been really interested in parallels between powwow and other forms of, kind of complementary medicine through prayer. And it's statistically apparently something that's working for some folks. Any other thoughts? Right over here.
Do you have any information on whether or not every ancient culture has similar practices and beliefs?
I don't know that I can say every culture, but I have a lot of colleagues who study cross-cultural perspectives on folk medicine and charms and things along those lines, and it was all over the British Isles. Many of those types of traditions also found their way to the New World as well, because there were folks who were using verbal charms, incantations, and prayers for the purpose of healing in areas that were not Pennsylvania Dutch. So this is not just relegated to the Pennsylvania Dutch. Sometimes you'll also find in like the Ozark Mountains, you'll find situations where you had both Pennsylvania Dutch and then also Scott-Irish influence, and you see elements of both that are present. Those are good examples here, but really if you do look all across the world, you'll find these types of traditions. There's been a lot of work done within the Jewish population. There's a lot of Jewish folk medicine as well that has a lot in common, even with the Pennsylvania Dutch. And the interesting thing is that there are Yiddish, especially benedictions and prayers. And Yiddish is actually the sister language of Pennsylvania Dutch. They're both 10th and 11th century dialects that came out of Central Europe around the exact same time, and they're mutually intelligible. When I speak Pennsylvania Dutch to a person who speaks Yiddish, we only have some minor differences in the words we're using, but the basic structure of the language is so similar. So it is interesting to note that you'll find these types of practices in a lot of different places, but pretty much everybody I talk to that is interested or taking an interest in this sort of thing can find examples in other cultures. But I can't say for sure every culture has something. We're not always conscious of the way in which we're practicing folk medicine. Sometimes it's easier to notice that in others and to say, oh, look at that, that's different from what I do. It's harder to see that in yourself sometimes. That's my experience. Another question over here.
Does powwow associate disease with sin?
Occasionally you'll find that to be the case. Some of the earliest written prayers that are used, at the very end of the prayer, it'll say, do this in the spirit of penance, and then it'll have as well, following up with, so many Our Fathers, creeds, and Ave Marias, indicating that this was probably a Roman Catholic practice at one point in time. And we have to remember that, of course, a lot of the practices among the Pennsylvania Dutch are traditions that even predate Protestantism. So there is a sense that many of these things may have actually been since before the time of the Reformation, so that it makes sense that you'll find Roman Catholic elements cropping up within folk medicine. There are some beliefs about this, and of course penance is done specifically when a person believes that they have sinned in order to be able to do something to absolve that. And I don't want to go too far into theology of sin, but it's an interesting situation. There are some situations where folks will say, I got sick because I did something wrong. And that's a common folk belief in many different cultures. I know a couple different folks who have genetic disorders, who believe. I know one man in particular who told me, oh, I have this genetic disorder because one of my distant ancestors, and he can even name them by name, claims that this person did this thing that affected the whole family all the way down the line. And of course, this is a biblical perspective. Some people say that, of course, the sins of the fathers are going to be vested upon the 7th generation. So you'll see this kind of thing, or actually, I think it's the 10th generation, they say. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But it is interesting to see there are some folks who do think that oftentimes people think about illness as being an aberration within a divine created world, that the illness is the aberration that needs to be pushed out by use of divine forces. So you can see how illness and sin could be locked into a similar category, but not always. It's not always considered to be the source. Of course, sometimes as well, illness is also the result of something you do. You fall down and you hurt yourself and you get an issue from that. Infections or things like that. Sometimes folks also believe that there were spirits that brought illness with them, that the spirit of an illness had come into your body. These are early beliefs before pathology recognized that, of course, we have bacteria and viruses that cause illnesses. Prior to that, people knew you got something, but they didn't have words for it. So oftentimes they talked about it in spiritual terms because it was the only kind of ecology they could really understand. So there's a lot to that, I think. Another question here in the back.
Does your research delve into like the origins of why a specific phrase or why a specific word or why a specific object such as a potato or a quill, like do those date back to like pre-Lutheranism, pre-Roman Catholicism?
I have to say that at least for me, it's very difficult to trace back too far. Most of my experience is dealing with Pennsylvania traditions. I do look to European sources to understand those things the best that I can. I find it problematic depending on how far you go back because, just because we have the Merseburg Zauberspruch, the early piece of Germanic writing that I mentioned, doesn't mean that we have any context for how to understand that, because people weren't writing about all the additional practices. They were writing some little isolated, especially verbal charms and prayers. And this is something that was going on in many areas. There are Old English ones, ones that are done in very early forms of English as well. So it's hard to say. There are commonalities in some of those things, so some of my work does touch base on that. I do have a new book that's going to be coming out in 2017 on this particular practice through the Heritage Center at Kutztown. In advance of that, though, I'm also I'm selling this evening. All proceeds are going to the Heritage Center. And this is a book entitled PowWowing in Pennsylvania. Just like my talk tonight, you'll see some very similar things. I'll also talk about further even some more symbolism and aspects in here about why people were doing certain things. For instance, there's some ideas as well that people have about the potato. You cut a potato in half, what do you end up with? A circular shape that's nice and white, that looks somewhat like the moon that you're going to be looking at when you're performing the ritual. So there's a correspondence there. People used to have the word sympathy, that they described that correspondence. Not sympathy, think of it today when you feel bad for someone else or you're experiencing someone else's pain. It's an idea that there were at one point in time subtle ways that all aspects of existence were connected. In the medieval sense, they used the word sympathy for that, when two things were sympathetic to one another. So yes, my work does deal with that kind of stuff, but I only take it so far back because I take it only about as far back as some of the sources will tell. And most of the work I like to do is with living people. I like to inform what I'm learning from living people by looking at these older sources, but I don't want to get lost in books. I want to spend most of my time dealing with what's present, because if I look too far back, I'm going to miss what's right here, right now, and there's so much that's still going on in Pennsylvania today. Any other thoughts, questions? Right over here.
What is the symbolism of the three crosses?
The three crosses that you see, oftentimes especially, you'll find these on written documents. You'll find either three X's or three crosses. Most people say it's in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. In some cases, you'll also find the three kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar. Sometimes you'll even find CMB next to them. So they can mean a couple different things. The belief is also that there were trinities that were used even before the Christian Trinity. Some people will say the Maiden, Mother, and Crone in some modern adaptations of earlier pagan charms that were used. That was probably not the intention of any of the Pennsylvania Dutch. They were definitely using mostly Christian metaphors to talk about the things that were going to be healing them. It was primarily a Christian culture. But you find all kinds of correspondences to other cultures that also will use rounds of three as a means to connect to this idea of the divine. And in many cultures, the number three is considered a sacred number. So this is not unique to the Pennsylvania Dutch, but usually it's implying the Holy Spirit, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. Any other questions? All righty. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight.